In the kingdom where silence was considered a curse and voice meant power, Prince Kael had learned to live in a world that spoke a language he could never hear. Born under storm clouds that split the night like divine judgment, he emerged into existence wrapped in an unnatural quiet that would define every breath he drew thereafter. While other royal children announced their arrival with lusty cries that proclaimed their strength, Kael simply watched, pale blue eyes drinking in a world that moved its lips in endless conversation he was forever barred from joining. 22 years later, that silence had become both his prison and his shield. The nobles who should have revered him instead whispered behind raised hands about the broken prince, whose deafness marked him as unfit for the throne. His father, King Theron, a man whose very presence could freeze blood in mortal veins, looked upon his only heir with the cold disappointment reserved for weapons that had failed to sharpen properly. Yet in the spaces between heartbeats, in the tremor of floorboards beneath approaching feet, in the dance of shadows across stone walls, Kael had learned to hear with everything except his ears. He read the fear in servants' hurried steps, the anger in slammed doors, the grief that clung to castle corridors like morning mist. His world was painted in vibrations and whispers of wind, in the language of things felt rather than heard. But some truths he had come to believe were meant to remain forever beyond his reach, until the day a young Omega with healing hands and secrets darker than midnight walked through his chamber doors, carrying with her the one sound that could shatter the walls of his silent kingdom, a voice that would call to him not through his ears, but through the very depths of his soul. In her eyes, forest green and filled with the same careful isolation he knew too well, Kael glimpsed a reflection of his own hidden pain. Neither of them knew that their meeting would awaken powers that kings had died to suppress, or that their forbidden bond would force them to choose between the safety of silence and the dangerous beauty of being truly heard. Some voices, after all, were worth dying for, and some loves were worth breaking the world to protect. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The storm that ravaged the kingdom on the night of Prince Kael's birth should have been the first warning. Lightning split the sky like divine judgment, while thunder shook the very foundations of the obsidian castle. Queen Solara screamed through labor that lasted 18 grueling hours, her cries echoing through corridors where servants whispered prayers and nobles exchanged worried glances. When Kael finally emerged into the world, silence followed him like a shadow. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping babe, but something deeper, an absence that seemed to swallow sound itself. The royal physician clapped his hands beside the newborn's ear, snapped his fingers, even shouted, but the prince's pale blue eyes remained unfocused, unbothered by the cacophony around him. King Theron's expression that night became legend among the castle staff. Those brave enough to witness it described a face carved from winter itself, beautiful, terrible, and utterly unforgiving. "He cannot hear," the physician whispered, his voice trembling like autumn leaves. The king's silence stretched longer than the storm. When he finally spoke, his words fell like executioner's blades. "Then he is no son of mine." 22 years later, that pronouncement still echoed through every stone of Castle Morwen. Prince Kael stood at his chamber window, watching the morning hunt depart without him. Again, his father's massive black wolf led the pack, a creature of pure dominance whose howl could freeze blood in mortal veins. Behind him ran the court's most favored, Lords Garrett and Ashford, Lady Vivian with her silver coat gleaming, and a dozen others whose only qualification was their ability to hear Theron's commands. Kael's jaw tightened as he pressed his palm against the cold glass. In another life, one where cruel fate hadn't stolen his hearing, he would have been leading that hunt. His wolf form was larger than most, his strength undeniable, his instincts sharp as any blade. But what use was a warrior who couldn't hear battle cries? What value did an alpha hold if he couldn't respond to his pack's calls? The door behind him creaked open. Kael didn't turn. He'd felt the vibration through the floorboards, subtle but distinct. Few dared enter his chambers uninvited, and fewer still moved with such hesitant steps. When he finally glanced over his shoulder, he found himself studying a young woman he'd never seen before. She was small, even for an Omega, with dark hair that caught the morning light like silk. Her simple gray dress marked her as servant class, but something in her posture, straight-backed, despite her obvious nervousness, suggested she possessed more courage than most nobles. Their eyes met, and Kale felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, though she was undeniably lovely, but recognition of something familiar. The way she held herself, carefully controlled yet ready to flee. He'd seen that same stance in his own mirror countless times. She was an outsider, just as he was. The woman, girl really, she couldn't be more than 20, raised her hand to her throat and made a series of quick gestures. Sign language. Kyle blinked in surprise. No one at court bothered learning the hand speech that his tutors had taught him. Even his personal guards communicated through written notes when absolutely necessary. "Your Highness," her hand said, the movements precise despite their slight tremor. "I am Lyria. I've been assigned to serve your chambers." Kyle moved closer, intrigued despite himself. Up close, he could see that her eyes were an unusual shade of green, like forest shadows, and that her hands bore small calluses, evidence of hard work rather than noble leisure. "Who assigned you?" He signed back, noting how her shoulders relaxed slightly at his response. "Master Donovan, Your Highness." The previous girl, she requested transfer to the kitchens. Kale almost smiled. The previous girl had been Meredith, a flighty Omega who'd spent more time staring at him in fearful fascination than actually cleaning. She'd lasted exactly 3 days before begging for reassignment, claiming the prince's unnatural silence disturbed her sleep. Most servants found his presence unsettling. They expected princes to be commanding, vocal, dominant in all the ways that mattered to wolf society. Instead, they got Kale, a man who moved through the world like a ghost, whose power remained locked behind walls of silence they couldn't understand. "Why did you request this position?" Kyle asked, genuinely curious. Most Omegas avoided him entirely. Lyria's hand stilled for a moment, and something vulnerable flickered across her features. "I didn't request it, Your Highness, but I understand silence." Before Kale could ask what she meant, commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Heavy footsteps, the clink of armor, and the particular vibration that meant only one thing. His father approached. Lyria must have heard it too, because she immediately dropped into a deep curtsy, her head bowed so low that her dark hair fell like a curtain around her face. The chamber doors burst open without ceremony. King Theron filled the doorway like a storm-given form, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through black hair that only added to his intimidating presence. His eyes, pale blue like Kale's own, swept the room with predatory assessment. Those eyes paused on Lyria, narrowing slightly. Kale watched his father's nostrils flare, testing her scent, reading the chemical signatures that marked rank and lineage. Whatever he found there made his expression harden further. "Another Omega servant," Theron said, his voice carrying the authority that made even alphas submit. He spoke aloud, rather than signing, as he always did, a constant reminder that he would not bend his communication to accommodate his defective son. "I trust this one will prove more durable than her predecessor." Kale's hands moved in response. "She has just arrived. Give her time to prove herself." Theron's gaze snapped to Kale's hands, then to his face, cold disapproval radiating from every line of his posture. The king stepped fully into the room, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller, more oppressive. "I did not come here to discuss your domestic arrangements," Theron said, each word precise and cutting. "Lord Commander Marcus has submitted his monthly report. Your training scores remain adequate, but adequacy is not excellence, and excellence is not greatness. The bloodline of kings demands nothing less than perfection." Kale's jaw clenched. He'd spent years proving himself in combat, strategy, and leadership. His disability didn't diminish his intelligence or his strength, yet his father remained convinced that a silent prince was a weak one. "My abilities speak for themselves," Kale signed. "I ask for no special consideration." "Your abilities," Theron repeated, the word dripping with disdain, "are handicapped by a fundamental flaw. You cannot hear the howls of your pack. You cannot respond to battle cries. In war, such limitations prove fatal, not just for you, but for those foolish enough to follow you." The words struck like physical blows, each one designed to wound. Kyle had heard variations of this speech countless times, but it never lost its power to cut deep. He was a disappointment, a failure, a prince who would never be worthy of his father's throne. From the corner of his vision, Kyle saw Lyria's hands clench into small fists. Her head remained bowed, but tension radiated from her small frame. She was angry, he realized with surprise. angry on his behalf. "The Northern Lords have requested another meeting about succession," Theron continued, his voice growing colder. "They question whether a deaf prince can effectively rule. I grow weary of making excuses for you." "Then stop making them." Cale's hand snapped with more force than intended. "Let me prove my worth through action rather than your words." Something dangerous flickered in Theron's pale eyes. "Prove your worth? Very well. The autumn festival approaches. You will lead the ceremonial hunt, alone. If you can bring down a wild boar using only your other senses, perhaps the lords will see that my son possesses some value beyond his title." Cale's blood chilled. A solo hunt was dangerous enough for experienced trackers with full hearing. For someone like him, it bordered on execution by proxy, but refusing would only confirm his father's assessment of his weakness. "I accept," he signed, keeping his expression neutral despite the fear clawing at his chest. Theron's smile held no warmth. "Excellent. I look forward to seeing what my heir is truly capable of." His gaze shifted back to Lyria, who remained frozen in her curtsy. "Omega, stand." Lyria rose slowly, keeping her eyes downcast as protocol demanded. But Cale caught the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breathing had quickened. His father's presence affected her the same way it affected most people, with primal, instinctive fear. "What pack do you hail from?" Theron asked, circling Lyria like a predator studying prey. "Riverside Pack, Your Majesty," Lyria whispered, her voice so soft Cale had to read her lips to understand. "Before the plague took them." Theron paused mid-circle. "Riverside. I remember that territory. Good hunting grounds if memory serves. All dead?" "All dead, Your Majesty. And you survived because—" "I was traveling to market when the sickness struck, Your Majesty. When I returned—" Her voice faltered. "When you returned, there was nothing left," Theron finished. "How convenient. And afterward, how did you come to serve in my castle?" "The church took me in, Your Majesty. When they heard of the need for household staff, they sent me here." Theron completed his circle, coming to stand directly in front of her. Even though Lyria was taller than average for an Omega, the king towered over her, his shadow falling across her like a physical weight. "Look at me," he commanded. Lyria's head lifted slowly, reluctantly, until her green eyes met his pale blue ones. Kyle watched, fascinated despite himself, as something indefinable passed between them. His father's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming more focused. "You may serve here," Theron said finally, his voice losing some of its edge. "But remember your place, Omega. This castle has little patience for disobedience or complications." "Yes, Your Majesty." Theron turned back toward the door, then paused. "Cale, do not embarrass me at the hunt. The Northern Lords grow restless, and I will not have them question my bloodline's strength because of your limitations." With that final blow, the king departed, leaving silence in his wake. Cale stood frozen for a long moment, processing the encounter. A solo hunt. Against wild boar. It was a death sentence dressed as an opportunity, and they both knew it. Gentle fingers touched his arm. Cale spun, startled by the unexpected contact. Lyria had moved closer, her expression filled with something he rarely saw directed at him. Sympathy. Not pity. Sympathy. As if she understood exactly what his father's words had cost him. "He is wrong about you," she signed, her movements careful but clear. Cale stared at her hands, then at her face. "You don't know me well enough to make that judgment." "I know enough," she replied. "I know that strength isn't measured by what we can hear, but by how we choose to listen with everything else we have." Something warm unfurled in Cale's chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. When was the last time someone had offered him comfort without expecting anything in return? When had anyone suggested that his disability might not define his worth? "Why did you really come here?" he asked, studying her face for tells. Lyria's hands hesitated. "Because I have nowhere else to go. And because maybe we both understand what it means to be different." Before Cale could respond, she stepped back, resuming her proper servant's posture. "Should I begin with the morning cleaning, Your Highness?" He wanted to tell her to forget protocol, to sit with him and explain what she'd meant about understanding silence. Instead, he nodded toward the sitting area where dust had gathered on surfaces no servant had properly tended in weeks. As Lyria moved to begin her work, Kyle found himself watching her with growing fascination. There was something about the way she moved, graceful despite her obvious nervousness, purposeful despite the uncertain situation she'd been thrown into. And when she occasionally glanced his way, those forest green eyes held depths he longed to explore. For the first time in years, Prince Kael felt less alone. He had no idea that across the castle, his father stood at his own window, pale eyes fixed on nothing, haunted by memories of another Omega with dark hair and gentle hands. An Omega who had died because of choices Theron could never unmake. History, it seemed, had a cruel sense of repetition. 3 days passed before Kael understood that Lyria was different from every other servant who had entered his chambers. She didn't flinch when he moved too quickly. She didn't stare at his mouth when he attempted to speak, something that made his voice crack from disuse and embarrassment. Most remarkably, she didn't treat his silence like a disease that might prove contagious. Instead, she worked with quiet efficiency, her presence becoming as natural as morning sunlight. She learned his routines without being told. Strong coffee before dawn, correspondence sorted by urgency rather than rank, and the sitting area arranged so he could see both the door and windows simultaneously. On the third evening, as autumn rain drummed against the windows, Kael found himself studying her more openly. Lyria knelt beside the fireplace, carefully arranging kindling with the focused attention of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on getting small things exactly right. The firelight caught copper threads in her dark hair and painted warm shadows across her profile. She was beautiful, Kael realized with a start, not in the polished, calculated way of court ladies, but with the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught or purchased. As if sensing his attention, Lyria glanced up. Their eyes met across the flickering light, and something passed between them, a moment of connection that had nothing to do with words or signs. "Your Highness," she said softly, then caught herself and switched to sign language. "Forgive me, I forgot." "Forgot what?" Kael signed back, genuinely curious. "That you cannot hear my voice." Her hands moved with increasing fluency. She'd been practicing, he realized. Kael considered this. In truth, he'd become quite skilled at reading lips over the years, catching fragments of speech when people forgot to face away from him. But most conversations at court weren't meant for his understanding anyway. "I can read lips somewhat," he admitted, "though most people prefer to pretend I understand nothing at all." Lyria's expression darkened. "That's cruel. That's politics." Kael moved to the chair across from her, close enough to the fire that its warmth touched his skin. In a world where strength equals voice, silence equals weakness, your father believes that. The observation was stated without judgment, but Kael felt its weight nonetheless. My father believes many things. Not all of them are true. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows that seemed to pulse with unspoken words. Then Lyria did something unexpected. She smiled, not the careful, practiced expression servants typically wore, but something genuine and bright that transformed her entire face. "What?" Kael asked, confused by her sudden warmth. "You have a sense of humor," she signed. "I wondered if princes were allowed such things. Officially? No. Unofficially." Kael found himself almost smiling in return. "I'm full of surprises. I'd like to learn them." The words hung in the air between them, innocent enough on the surface but carrying undercurrents that made Kael's pulse quicken. When was the last time someone had expressed genuine interest in knowing him beyond his title and disability? "Why?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Lyria's hands stilled for a moment, her gaze dropping to the fire. When she looked up again, vulnerability flickered in her green eyes like candlelight. "Because I think you see the world differently than others," she signed slowly. "And I think that might be a gift rather than a curse." Kael's breath caught. No one had ever suggested his deafness might be anything other than a devastating flaw. Certainly not a gift. How could it possibly be a gift? "You watch everything," Lyria explained, her movements growing more animated. "I've seen you these past few days. You notice things others miss because they're too busy listening to their own voices. You see the servant who limps because her shoes don't fit. You notice when the morning light makes the tapestries glow differently. You feel the vibrations when someone approaches with anger versus fear." Kael stared at her, stunned by the accuracy of her observations. He had developed those skills by necessity, turning his other senses into instruments of survival. But no one had ever framed them as advantages before. "You're very observant yourself," he signed. "I have to be." Something shadowed crossed her expression. When you're an Omega alone in the world, observation becomes survival. Tell me about your pack, Kyle said impulsively. Before the plague. Lyria's hands dropped to her lap, her shoulders tensing. For a moment, Kale thought she would refuse to answer. Then quietly, she began to sign. Riverside was small, maybe 40 wolves total. We lived simply, fishing, farming, trading with neighboring territories. My parents ran the local inn. I helped with cooking and cleaning. Were you happy? Very. A soft smile touched her lips. My father would tell stories by the fire each night. My mother taught me to braid herbs for medicine and protection. I had 2 younger brothers who followed me everywhere like devoted shadows. And they're all gone. All gone. Her hands moved mechanically now, as if emotion had been carefully locked away. The plague took the strong first, then the weak. By the time I returned from market, even the children were dead. The whole territory was silent as a tomb. Kyle felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. He'd lost his hearing, but she'd lost everything. Family, home, identity, the entire foundation of her world. I'm sorry, he signed, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to offer them anyway. Death comes for everyone eventually, Lyria replied. The lucky ones get to choose how they face it. Before Kyle could ask what she meant, commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Not the measured footsteps of servants or guards, but something chaotic. Running, shouting, the kind of disturbance that usually meant either celebration or disaster. Kale rose and moved to the door, pressing his palm against the wood to feel the vibrations more clearly. Multiple people were running past his chambers, their footsteps heavy with urgency. Something's wrong, he signed to Lyria, who had also stood. She moved to the window, peering down into the courtyard. Her expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. There's a crowd gathering, she signed quickly. And, Your Highness, I think someone's been hurt. Kale's blood chilled. Without waiting for propriety or permission, he strode to the door and yanked it open. The corridor buzzed with activity, servants rushing past, their faces pale with shock and fear. He caught the arm of a passing guard, a young beta named Marcus, who'd always treated him with grudging respect. What happened? Kyle spoke aloud, his voice rusty from disuse, but clear enough to be understood. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. Most people forgot the prince could speak at all. Your Highness, there's been an accident. Lord Garrett's son fell from his horse during training. He's not responding. Ice spread through Kale's veins. Lord Garrett was one of his father's most trusted advisors, and his son Edmund was barely 16, a promising young alpha who'd shown Kale more courtesy than most nobles bothered with. I need to go, Kale signed to Lyria as Marcus hurried away. I'm coming with you. You don't need to. You might need an extra pair of eyes, she interrupted. And I know something about healing. Kale paused, studying her face. There was something in her expression, determination mixed with an odd sort of recognition, as if she'd seen this kind of crisis before. They made their way through the castle corridors, following the stream of people toward the main courtyard. Kale could feel the collective anxiety in the air, the way crowds moved when tragedy struck close to home. The scene that greeted them was chaos barely contained. A circle of nobles, guards, and servants surrounded a still form lying on the cobblestones. Lord Garrett knelt beside his son, his usually composed face twisted with anguish, while the court physician worked frantically over Edmund's motionless body. King Theron stood at the edge of the circle, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating the kind of tension that preceded either salvation or execution. Kale pushed through the crowd until he could see Edmund clearly. The young man lay unconscious, his face pale as parchment, blood matting his brown hair where his head had struck stone. The court physician, an elderly man named Master Aldrich, moved his hands over Edmund's body with growing desperation. The head wound is severe, Aldrich announced, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. I can tend the external bleeding, but if there's damage inside. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lord Garrett looked up at the king, raw desperation in his eyes. Your Majesty, surely there's someone who might help. I'll pay anything, give anything. Master Aldrich is the finest physician in the kingdom, Theron replied, his voice carefully neutral. If he cannot help your son, then perhaps it's time to accept— No! The word tore from Garrett's throat like a howl. He's my only child, my heir. There has to be something. Cale felt movement beside him and turned to see Lyria pushing through the crowd. Her face was pale but determined, and something in her posture had changed. Gone was the careful deference of a servant, replaced by the focused intensity of someone with purpose. "Let me see him," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. Master Aldrich looked up sharply. "Omega, this is no place for—" "Let me see him," Lyria repeated more firmly this time. She was already moving forward, dropping to her knees beside Edmund, despite the shocked murmurs from the watching nobles. Kyle saw his father's eyes narrow dangerously. King Theron didn't tolerate disruption or insubordination, especially not from Omegas who forgot their place. But before anyone could stop her, Lyria placed her hands on either side of Edmund's head. The moment her skin touched his, everything changed. Light erupted from her palms, not harsh or blinding, but warm and golden like concentrated sunlight. The crowd gasped collectively, several people stumbling backward in shock. Even Cale, who'd thought himself beyond surprise, felt his heart stutter. But it wasn't the light that stopped his breath. It was the sound. For the first time in 22 years, Prince Cale could hear. Not everything. Not the gasps of the crowd, or the whisper of wind through the courtyard. Just one voice, clear and melodious as mountain water, singing softly in a language he didn't recognize. Lyria's voice. Somehow, impossibly, he could hear Lyria singing. The healing song washed over him like a physical presence, each note resonating in his bones, his blood, his very soul. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever experienced. Not just the melody itself, but the fact that he could experience it at all. Beneath Lyria's glowing hands, Edmund's color began to return. His breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, deepened and steadied. The bleeding from his head wound slowed, then stopped entirely. Slowly, impossibly, his eyes opened. "Father?" Edmund whispered, his voice confused but clear. "What happened? Why is everyone staring?" Lord Garrett let out a sound between a sob and a laugh, pulling his son into a fierce embrace. Around them, the crowd erupted in amazement and relief, but Cale heard none of it, because the moment Lyria lifted her hands from Edmund's head, the beautiful voice in his mind went silent. The deafness returned like a wall slamming down, cutting him off from the world once again. But the memory of that voice, her voice, echoed in his mind like a promise. Lyria swayed slightly, exhaustion clear in every line of her body. Without thinking, Cale stepped forward and caught her arm, steadying her before she could collapse. Their eyes met, and he saw his own shock reflected in her green gaze. She was as surprised by what had happened as everyone else. "How?" He signed desperately, needing answers even as chaos swirled around them. "I don't know," she replied, her hands trembling with fatigue. It's never worked like that before." Before Cale could ask what she meant, a shadow fell across them both. King Theron stood over them, his pale eyes fixed on Lyria with an expression Cale had never seen before. Not anger or disgust, but something that looked almost like fear. "Omega," Theron said, his voice cutting through the celebration around Edmund's recovery like a blade through silk. "You will come with me. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the full weight of alpha authority, the kind of order that compelled obedience on a cellular level. Lyria struggled to her feet, still leaning slightly on Cale's arm for support. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Don't go," Cale signed quickly, panic rising in his chest. Something about his father's expression set every instinct on high alert. But Lyria was already moving away, following the king toward the castle entrance. Before she disappeared from view, she glanced back at Kyle one final time. "I heard you," he signed across the distance, not caring who might see. Her step faltered for just a moment. Then she nodded slightly and allowed herself to be led away. Cale stood frozen in the courtyard as the crowd gradually dispersed, nobles and servants returning to their duties with excited chatter about the miracle they'd witnessed. Lord Garrett thanked everyone profusely, his relief and joy radiating like warmth from a forge. But all Cale could think about was the sound of Lyria's voice in his mind, impossibly sweet, achingly beautiful, and now terrifyingly silent. For the first time in his life, he understood what he'd been missing, and now that he'd had a taste of it, the silence felt like a living thing trying to strangle him. He had to find her, had to understand what had happened between them, had to hear her voice again, even if it destroyed him. As he made his way back toward the castle, Cale didn't notice the figure watching from an upper window. Master Aldrich, the court physician, his weathered face creased with worry and something that looked remarkably like guilt. The old man had recognized the power Lyria wielded, had seen it once before, 23 years ago, in another young woman with dark hair and healing hands, a woman who had died screaming in the castle dungeons after King Theron discovered what she truly was. History, Master Aldrich knew, had a way of repeating itself, and this time, he feared, the consequences would be even more devastating. The king's private study was a monument to power and paranoia. Ancient tomes lined the walls, their leather bindings cracked with age and secrets. Maps of conquered territories spread across mahogany tables, marked with red pins that represented blood spilled in service to the crown. And at the center of it all sat King Theron behind a desk, carved from the heartwood of the sacred grove, a tree that had taken 700 years to grow and mere hours to fall. Lyria stood before that desk now, her hands clasped so tightly behind her back that her knuckles had gone white. The healing light had drained more from her than she'd expected, leaving her legs shaky and her mind clouded with exhaustion. But beneath the physical weakness, terror coiled like a living thing. She had revealed herself, after years of careful hiding, of smothering her true nature beneath layers of practiced normalcy. She had let her power shine forth for all to see. And worst of all, she had felt the prince's mind touch hers when their connection formed. For one impossible moment, Cale had heard her voice, not through his ears, but through something deeper, more intimate, a bond that should have been impossible between them. King Theron had not spoken since they'd entered his study. He merely watched her with those pale blue eyes, as if she were a puzzle he was methodically solving. The silence stretched until Lyria's nerves felt ready to snap. Finally, he rose from his chair with predatory grace and began to circle her, much as he had done during their first meeting. But this time, there was nothing casual about his assessment. This was a hunter studying prey. "Tell me about your parents," he said at last, his voice deceptively mild. "My lord?" The words came out as barely a whisper. "Your parents, from Riverside Pack. You said they ran an inn." "Yes, your majesty. The Willow Branch Inn. What were their names?" Lyria's mouth went dry. "Marcus and Elena Ashworth, your majesty." Theron paused directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "And your mother's maiden name?" I don't see how that's relevant." "Answer the question." The command carried enough alpha force to make Lyria's knees buckle. Only her grip on the chair in front of her kept her upright. "Ravencrest," she gasped. Her maiden name was Ravencrest. The silence that followed was so complete that Lyria could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Behind her, King Theron had gone utterly still. "Ravencrest," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the name on his tongue. "From the Northern Territories, a bloodline known for unusual gifts." Lyria's blood turned to ice. No, he couldn't know, couldn't possibly remember. "Turn around," Theron commanded. She obeyed reluctantly, turning to face him with dread pooling in her stomach. The king stood mere inches away, his pale eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her feel flayed open. "You have her eyes," he said softly, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice carried something other than cold authority. "Your grandmother's eyes. I should have seen it immediately. I don't know what you mean, your majesty. Don't lie to me." The gentleness vanished from his tone like mist before flame. "I knew Isla Ravencrest 23 years ago. She had the same green eyes, the same dark hair, the same gift." Lyria's legs gave out entirely. She collapsed into the chair behind her, all pretense of ignorance crumbling like sand. "She was my grandmother," she whispered, "but she died when I was small. I barely remember her. She died because I killed her." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through Lyria's entire being. She stared at King Theron, waiting for him to take it back, to explain that he'd misspoken. Instead, he moved to the window overlooking the courtyard where, just an hour ago, she had saved a dying boy's life. "Your grandmother was the most powerful healer I'd ever encountered," Theron said, his voice distant with memory. "She could mend bones with a touch, cure diseases that had plagued bloodlines for generations. When word of her abilities reached my father, he summoned her to court." Lyria found her voice, though it came out cracked and small. "Why would he kill her for that?" Healing is a gift from the moon goddess herself. Theron's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Because healing wasn't her only gift. Isla Ravencrest could do something far more dangerous. She could awaken dormant powers in others. Abilities that had been deliberately suppressed. Magic that my bloodline had worked for centuries to erase. Understanding dawned like a cold sunrise. The old magic. The kind that existed before the wars. Before my ancestors conquered this land and reshaped it to their will. Yes, Theron turned back to face her, his expression carved from granite. Magic was wild then, unpredictable. It chose its own vessels regardless of rank or bloodline. Alphas who could control minds. Betas who could see the future. Omegas who could heal mortal wounds or... He paused, his gaze fixed on her with laser intensity. Or awaken gifts in others through touch. Lyria's hands began to tremble. That's not what happened today. I just healed the boy. That's all. Is it? Theron moved closer, looming over her. Then explain to me why my son, who has been deaf since birth, suddenly heard your voice during the healing. Explain why the bond between you formed so quickly, so completely, that even I could feel its resonance from across the courtyard. The room spun around Lyria like a child's top. Kael had heard her. She'd felt something pass between them during the healing, some invisible thread connecting her mind to his, but she'd thought it was just the intensity of the moment. No, she breathed. That's impossible. Mates bonds take time to form. They require compatibility of soul and power, Theron finished, which you have provided in abundance. The question is whether you did so intentionally. I would never manipulate anyone like that. Perhaps not consciously, but power like yours doesn't always wait for conscious direction. Theron crouched down until they were at eye level, his pale gaze boring into hers. Tell me, little healer, when you were a child, did strange things happen around you? Did people behave differently after you touched them? Did the injured heal faster than they should have? Lyria's throat closed entirely. Because yes, strange things had happened. Her youngest brother's broken arm had mended in days rather than weeks after she'd held his hand through the fever. The innkeeper's wife had conceived her first child after years of barrenness, just weeks after Lyria had helped tend her during a bout of winter sickness. She'd thought it was coincidence, had convinced herself it meant nothing. I see the truth in your eyes, Theron said softly. You've always known you were different. You've simply been afraid to acknowledge what that difference meant. Even if that's true, Lyria said desperately. I've never hurt anyone. I only want to help. Your grandmother said the same thing. Theron rose to his full height, towering over her once again. She believed her gifts were meant to heal the world. Instead, she nearly destroyed my kingdom. How? By awakening powers in people who couldn't control them. A beta guard who suddenly developed the ability to read minds went mad from hearing everyone's thoughts simultaneously. An Omega servant girl began seeing death omens and killed herself to escape the visions. A young alpha discovered he could compel absolute obedience and used it to build a rebellion that cost thousands of lives. Lyria felt sick. I didn't know. I never meant... Intention is irrelevant when the consequences are so devastating. Theron returned to his desk, pulling open a drawer with deliberate precision. Your grandmother unleashed chaos with the best of intentions. I will not allow history to repeat itself. The object he withdrew made Lyria's blood freeze in her veins. It was a collar of dark metal, inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight. Even from across the room, she could feel the wrongness radiating from it like heat from a forge. Void-forged iron, Theron explained, noting her horrified expression. Mined from the deepest caverns and blessed by priests of the old faith. It suppresses magical abilities completely. Your grandmother wore one just like it during her final days. You can't, Lyria whispered, backing toward the door. Please, I promise I won't use my abilities again. I'll leave the kingdom, disappear completely. You'll do no such thing. Theron's voice carried the full weight of alpha command, freezing her in place. You've already bonded with my heir. Breaking that connection now would likely kill him, and possibly you as well. Lyria's world tilted sideways. Bonded? But we barely know each other. We've only spoken a few times. Mate bonds don't require extensive courtship when they're forged by power like yours, Theron said matter-of-factly. The connection between you and Kael is already deeper than most mated pairs achieve after years together. You awoke something in him that had been dormant since birth. His hearing? Among other things. Theron approached her slowly, the collar held loosely in his hands. My son was not born naturally deaf, Lyria. His hearing was bound by the same priests who forged this collar, sealed away to prevent him from accessing the magical heritage my family has spent generations trying to erase. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. You had your own son's hearing magically suppressed? I had my son's dangerous potential contained, Theron corrected coldly. Cale's bloodline carries power from both sides. My family's old alpha magic and his mother's prophetic gifts. Together, they could have made him unstoppable, or they could have driven him mad. So you chose to cripple him instead. Something dangerous flickered in Theron's eyes. I chose to protect him from a fate worse than deafness. But now, thanks to your intervention, those bindings are beginning to crack. Soon, my son will start manifesting abilities he was never meant to possess. Lyria thought of the moment during the healing, when she'd felt Cale's mind brush against hers. Not just hearing her voice, but something deeper. A recognition that had resonated in her very soul. What kind of abilities? She asked quietly. The kind that could reshape kingdoms, or destroy them. Theron stopped just within arm's reach, close enough that she could see the conflict warring in his pale eyes. Which is why you're going to help me stop it. I don't understand. This collar will suppress your healing abilities, but it won't break the bond between you and Cale completely. You'll remain connected enough to monitor his development, to warn me if his powers begin manifesting in dangerous ways. Theron lifted the collar slightly. In return, you'll be allowed to live, to serve as his companion. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Lyria's cheeks burn. You're asking me to spy on him, to betray the bond you say we share. I'm asking you to help me save his life, Theron replied. Because if Cale's powers fully awaken, there are forces in this kingdom that will stop at nothing to either control or destroy him. The Northern Lords already question his fitness to rule. If they discover he possesses the old magic, they'll kill him, Lyria finished, understanding finally dawning. They'll try, and in the ensuing civil war, thousands will die. Theron's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You have a choice, little healer. Accept the collar and help me protect my son from his own destiny, or refuse, and watch that destiny consume him. Lyria stared at the collar, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. She could feel Cale somewhere in the castle, their new bond humming like a tuning fork in her chest. He was searching for her, she realized, worried about what his father might do. If I accept, she said slowly, what guarantees do I have that you won't simply kill me once I'm no longer useful? You have my word as king. The same word you gave my grandmother before you executed her? Theron's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny the accusation. Your grandmother's death was necessary to prevent greater catastrophe. Yours will be necessary only if you prove as reckless with power as she did. It wasn't much of a guarantee, but Lyria suspected it was the only one she would get. The alternative, refusing and watching Cale suffer the consequences, wasn't really an option at all. The collar, she said carefully. Will it cause pain? Only if you attempt to use your abilities while wearing it. Otherwise, you'll barely notice its presence. Another lie, she suspected. But what choice did she have? I accept, she whispered. Relief flickered across Theron's features. So briefly she almost missed it. A wise decision. He moved behind her, and Lyria felt the cold metal settle against her throat like a noose. The moment the collar's edges touched, agony exploded through her nervous system. Every cell in her body screamed in protest as the void-forged iron made contact with her skin. But worse than the physical pain was the sensation of her abilities being stripped away. The healing light that had always hummed just beneath her consciousness went dark, leaving a hollow ache where her power used to reside. When the collar clicked shut, Lyria collapsed to her knees, gasping for air that felt thin and tasteless. The pain will fade, Theron said, though his voice sounded distant through the ringing in her ears. In time, you'll barely remember what it felt like to touch your power. Lyria struggled to her feet, one hand pressed to the collar. The metal was warm against her skin now, pulsing with a rhythm that felt nothing like her own heartbeat. Cale will ask questions, she managed, about the collar, about why I can't heal anymore. Tell him it's a focusing device, a way to control and channel your abilities more precisely. Theron moved to his desk, already dismissing her from his attention. He'll believe it because he wants to believe it. And if he discovers the truth? Theron's pale eyes met hers one final time, and in them she saw the weight of terrible choices and darker secrets. "Then you'd better hope your bond with him is stronger than his sense of justice," he said quietly. "Because if my son ever learns what I've done, to him, to you, to your grandmother, he'll tear this kingdom apart trying to make it right." The dismissal was clear. Lyria curtsied deeply, the collar's weight making the gesture awkward, and turned toward the door. "Lyria." She paused, not turning around. "For what it's worth," Theron said, "I am genuinely sorry it came to this. In another world, under different circumstances, I might have welcomed a daughter-in-law with your gifts. The words might have been meant as comfort. Instead, they felt like an epitaph for the life she'd never get to live." Lyria left the king's study and walked through corridors that felt suddenly foreign, the collar's weight a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she stood to lose if she failed in her impossible task. She had become a prisoner in golden chains, tasked with protecting the man she was falling in love with from forces he didn't even know existed. And somewhere in the castle, Cale was waiting for her return, hoping for answers she could never give, and explanations that would damn them both. The beautiful voice he'd heard in his mind during the healing was already fading, smothered beneath layers of void-forged iron and bitter necessity. Soon, she feared, even their bond wouldn't be enough to bridge the growing silence between them. But perhaps, if she was very careful and very lucky, she could keep him alive long enough for love to find another way, even if it meant sacrificing herself in the process. Hours later, as midnight bells tolled across the kingdom, Prince Cale sat alone in his chambers, staring out at stars that seemed dimmer than they had that morning. Lyria had returned just after sunset, wearing a strange silver collar that she claimed would help her control her healing abilities. Her explanation had felt hollow, her smiles forced, but when he'd pressed for details, she'd changed the subject with practiced skill. Something was wrong. Terribly, desperately wrong. But every time he tried to reach for their bond, to understand what had changed between them, he encountered walls where there had once been windows. The woman who had awakened sound in his world was slipping away from him one silence at a time, and Cale, for all his newfound awareness of what he'd been missing, had no idea how to call her back. In the depths of the castle, King Theron stood before a portrait of his late queen, Cale's mother, whose prophetic dreams had driven her to madness before her early death. "Forgive me, Seraphina," he whispered to painted eyes that looked so much like their son's. "But I will not watch our boy suffer the same fate you did, even if it means becoming the monster he'll one day need to defeat." The portrait offered no absolution, only the eternal silence of the dead, and in the space between father and son, caught between duty and love, Lyria touched the collar at her throat and made a promise to whatever gods might be listening. She would find a way to save them all, even if it killed her. 1 year later, the autumn festival had always been Prince Cale's least favorite time of year, a celebration of harvest and abundance that traditionally ended with the ceremonial hunt his father had once used to humiliate him. But as he stood on the castle's main balcony, watching his people dance in the courtyard below, Cale found himself almost smiling. Almost, because the collar around Lyria's throat still caught the firelight, like a chain made of stars. "You're brooding again," she said softly from beside him, her voice carrying the gentle teasing that had become familiar over the months they'd spent navigating the careful dance of their restricted bond. "I can feel it through our connection." Kyle turned to study her profile in the flickering torchlight. A year of wearing the void-forged iron had taken its toll. She was thinner now, her healing light completely suppressed, her natural vibrancy dimmed to a pale echo of what it had once been. But her spirit remained unbroken, and her love for him shone through their bond like sunlight through storm clouds. "I'm thinking," he signed, their shared language having evolved into something uniquely theirs. Part traditional signs, part invented gestures that carried meanings only they understood. "Dangerous habit for princes," she replied with her hands, a smile tugging at her lips. "Especially princes who've recently discovered they can hear their father's thoughts when he's particularly angry." Lyria's expression sobered slightly. Kyle's emerging abilities had been unpredictable. The healing that had cracked his magical bindings had released more than just his hearing. Sometimes he caught fragments of minds around him, emotions, surface thoughts, even deeper secrets when people were under extreme stress. Last week, during a particularly heated council meeting about taxation, he'd accidentally heard every lord's private opinion about his fitness to rule. Most had been surprisingly supportive, but Lord Ashford's mental commentary about the crippled prince and his collared whore had nearly provoked Cale to violence. "Any interesting revelations tonight?" Lyria asked. "Just the usual. Lord Garrett is worried about his son's engagement. Lady Vivian is planning to seduce the visiting duke from the Eastern Territories. And my father." Cale hesitated, his hand stilling mid-sign. "What about your father? He's been dreaming about my mother again, about prophecies and choices he wishes he could unmake." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the festival below. Musicians played while couples spun through traditional dances, their laughter rising like incense toward the star-filled sky. It was beautiful, peaceful, everything a kingdom should be. And yet, Cale knew it was built on a foundation of lies and suppressed magic. "There's something I need to tell you," Lyria said suddenly, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear it. "What?" She glanced around nervously, checking for guards or servants who might be watching, then pulled him deeper into the shadows of the balcony's alcove. "I've been having dreams," she signed, her movements quick and urgent. "Strange ones. About your grandmother, the queen who died when you were young." Kyle's blood chilled. His paternal grandmother had been legendary for her prophetic abilities, but she died when he was barely 5 years old. He had only vague memories of a kind woman who used to sing him lullabies he couldn't hear, but could feel in his bones. "What kind of dreams?" "She's been teaching me things, showing me how the old magic works, how the bindings were made." Lyria's hands trembled slightly. "How they might be broken." Before Cale could respond, she reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew something that made his heart stop. A small silver key, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. "Where did you get that?" he demanded. "I made it, using techniques your grandmother showed me in the dreams. It's forged from the same metal as my collar, but blessed rather than cursed." Lyria's eyes met his, blazing with desperate hope. "I think it can free us both." Cale stared at the key, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. If they were caught attempting to remove the collar, his father would consider it an act of rebellion, treason punishable by death. But if they succeeded, "Are you certain it will work?" "No, but I'm certain we can't continue like this." Lyria stepped closer, close enough that he could see the determination burning in her green eyes. "I can feel my true self fading a little more each day, and your powers are growing stronger whether we acknowledge them or not. Soon, you'll be able to hear everyone's thoughts, feel every emotion in the castle. Without proper training, without the ability to shield yourself, it will drive me mad," Cale finished, understanding finally dawning. "Like it did my mother. Like it did your mother," Lyria confirmed. "Unless we find another way." Cale looked out at the festival again, watching his people celebrate in ignorant bliss. They had no idea their prince was slowly losing his grip on sanity, or that their king had built their golden age on the graves of innocent magic wielders. "If we do this," he signed slowly, "there's no going back. My father will see it as ultimate betrayal. And if we don't do this, you'll lose yourself entirely. And Lyria's hands stilled, then resumed with renewed determination. "I'll fade away to nothing, and our bond will die with me." The choice, when framed like that, wasn't really a choice at all. Kyle took the key from her trembling fingers, noting how warm it felt against his skin, as if it were alive, eager to fulfill its purpose. "Here?" he asked. "Here. Now, before we lose our courage." With infinite care, Cale inserted the key into the collar's hidden lock, a mechanism so small and cunningly disguised that he'd never noticed it before. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the key began to glow with soft silver light, and the collar's oppressive weight seemed to lessen. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking chains. The moment the void-forged iron fell away from Lyria's throat, several things happened at once. Light erupted from her skin, not the gentle glow of healing, but something far more powerful. The golden radiance poured from her like concentrated sunlight, washing over Kyle and sending electricity racing through every nerve. Their bond, which had been a whisper for months, suddenly blazed to life with the intensity of a forge fire. Cale felt Lyria's mind merge with his, her thoughts, her memories, her deepest emotions flooding through their connection, until he couldn't tell where she ended and he began. And through it all, he heard her voice, not just the sweet melody that had first awakened his hearing, but something deeper, the sound of her soul calling to his, the music of a love that had survived suppression and fear and the weight of terrible secrets. But even as joy filled his heart, Cale felt something else awakening, power that had been dormant his entire life, abilities his father had tried so desperately to contain. Images flooded his mind. His mother, dying young from prophetic visions she couldn't control. His grandmother, executed for awakening dangerous gifts in others. A bloodline of magic wielders stretching back centuries, each one more powerful and more unstable than the last. "I can feel everything," he gasped aloud, his voice rusty from months of disuse. "Everyone in the castle, their thoughts, their fears, I know." Lyria's real voice was like honey and starlight, washing over him with warmth that made the magical chaos more bearable. "But we'll learn to control it together. I'll teach you the shielding techniques your grandmother showed me. And if we can't control it, then we'll face the madness together too." Before Cale could respond, the balcony doors burst open behind them. King Theron stood framed in the doorway, his pale eyes taking in the scene with horrified understanding, the broken collar at Lyria's feet, the silver key in Cale's hand, the way magical light still flickered around them like aurora. "What have you done?" Theron whispered, his voice carrying a grief so profound it made Cale's heart ache. "Father, I can explain." "No explanation necessary." Theron stepped onto the balcony, his expression shifting from grief to terrible resolve. "I can see exactly what you've done. You've chosen to repeat the mistakes that destroyed your mother, that destroyed your grandmother, that will destroy you both before this ends." "We've chosen freedom," Lyria said, stepping protectively in front of Cale. "The right to be what we were born to be, rather than what fear has made us." Theron's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Freedom? Child, you have no idea what you've unleashed. The old magic doesn't grant freedom. It grants power beyond imagination, and the madness that inevitably follows." Guards were approaching now. Cale could hear their thoughts, feel their confusion and growing alarm as word spread through the castle that something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. "We have to go," Cale signed urgently. "Now before what?" Theron asked, apparently having learned to read sign language during the months of Cale's silent rebellion. "Before you flee into the wilderness like common fugitives? Before you abandon your birthright and your people? Before you let this kingdom fall into chaos because its prince chose love over duty?" The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to wound. But beneath his father's anger, Cale heard something else through their brief mental connection. Fear. Genuine, bone-deep terror that went beyond concern for the kingdom. Theron was afraid of losing his son the same way he'd lost his wife. "You could come with us," Cale signed impulsively. "Help us find a way to control this power instead of suppressing it. The old magic doesn't have to be destructive if it's properly guided." For just a moment, something vulnerable flickered in the king's pale eyes. Love, perhaps, or the memory of love, buried beneath decades of hard choices and harder truths. Then the moment passed, and King Theron became the ruler his kingdom needed him to be. Strong, unbending, willing to sacrifice anything for the greater good. "Guards," he called, his voice carrying the full weight of alpha authority. "Arrest the Omega for treason. She has corrupted the prince with forbidden magic." "No!" Kyle stepped forward, power crackling around him like visible lightning. "She did nothing wrong. If you want to punish someone, punish me." "Oh, my son," Theron said softly, sadly. "I will. But first, I have to save you from yourself." The guards moved forward reluctantly. None of them wanted to arrest their prince's mate, but royal commands couldn't be ignored. Cale felt their conflicted thoughts, their uncertainty, their genuine affection for him warring with their duty to obey. And in that moment of chaos and impossible choice, Lyria made a decision that changed everything. She kissed him, not gently, not with the careful restraint they'd maintained for months, but with desperate passion and love so fierce it could have melted stone. And through that kiss, through their fully awakened bond, she poured every technique her grandmother had taught her, every shielding method and control mechanism that could help him survive what was coming. When they finally broke apart, both of them glowing with silver light that made the guards step back in awe. Lyria smiled at him one final time. "Remember," she whispered, her voice carrying on the wind. "Love is stronger than fear, always." Then she shifted. But instead of the wolf form that every shifter possessed, Lyria transformed into something else entirely, a creature of pure light and healing energy, beautiful and terrible and utterly impossible. She was what the old texts called a Phoenix Omega, a being of such power that she could heal mortal wounds or bring down kingdoms with equal ease. The bloodline that Theron's ancestors had spent centuries trying to erase. In her new form, Lyria spread wings of golden fire and launched herself into the night sky, carrying with her the collar that had bound her and the painful knowledge that she was now too dangerous to stay. The last thing Cale heard before the distance grew too great was her voice in his mind, carrying a promise that sustained him through everything that followed. "I'll find a way back to you, no matter how long it takes, no matter what stands in our way. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." And as Prince Cale stood on the balcony watching his mate disappear into starlight, he felt his own transformation beginning. Not physical, but something deeper, the awakening of abilities that could reshape the world or destroy it entirely. His father had been right about one thing. The old magic granted power beyond imagination. The question was what Cale would choose to do with it. 5 years later, King Cale, for his father had abdicated rather than watch his son destroy himself with unchecked power, stood in the same castle courtyard where Lyria had first revealed her healing gifts. But now, the space had been transformed into something his ancestors would never have recognized. A school for young magic wielders, a place where omegas and alphas and betas could learn to control their gifts instead of having them suppressed. He was older now, his power stabilized through years of careful practice and the shielding techniques Lyria had given him. The madness that had claimed his mother and grandmother had never taken hold, not when he'd had love to anchor him and purpose to guide his choices. The kingdom prospered under his rule, not because he suppressed the old magic, but because he'd learned to harness it. Healers worked openly in every village. Seers helped predict weather patterns and prevent disasters. Even the mind readers, properly trained and ethically bound, served as counselors and mediators. It was everything Lyria had dreamed of during those long months, when her collar had kept her true self locked away. If only she were here to see it. Cale touched the silver pendant at his throat. Not a collar, but a communication device he'd forged himself, using techniques gleaned from ancient texts. Through it, he could sense Lyria's presence somewhere in the world, could feel her love and determination across whatever distance separated them. She was coming home, soon. And when she arrived, they would build a future that honored both tradition and progress, duty and love. A future where magic was a gift to be celebrated, not a curse to be feared. A future where the deaf prince who had learned to hear truth would finally claim his voice and use it to sing the world into something better than it had ever been before. The sound of freedom, at last. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.